What horrid secrets do your parents have and are oblivious to you being aware of? Someone tried to kill my father when he was in his teens. He has scars on his head from where he was beat with a hammer. He doesn't know that I know this, and I only know because I overheard a conversation between my grandmother and her brothers about the incident. My dad died when I was 14 and everyone refused to speak of it. My grandparents said he fell down the stairs. And they've maintained that to this day. My mom told me that he accidentally hung himself, and she'd tell me when I was older. It took 9th grade me all of about 3 days to figure out he had died of autoerotic asphyxiation. She confirmed it years later. My divorced parents are both cheating on their current spouses with each other. My mom had to do some soul searching for AA. She wrote a list called Life Resentments, and having kids was the first bullet point. Found it while I was looking for my social security card to apply for my first job at 16. She kept it in a safe. My mother told me the scars on her arm were from an accident, but they were clearly from one or multiple suicide attempts. I knew when I asked. But I'll let her lie. Edit. Row. I didn't check Reddit for 24 hours and all of this is here. 1. Yes. Her scars are for sure from suicide attempts. I confirmed with an aunt. 2. Also. They are on both arms. 5-7 in all. My dad used to talk about growing up really poor, having to get food from food banks, etc. It's one of the reasons that now that he owns his own business, he donates to food banks and all sorts of charities all the time, paying it back. Well, it turns out that my father's father owned a massive construction company and made millions of dollars in the 50s and 60s. My uncle was selling massive amounts of cocaine and got busted. My grandfather bankrupted himself paying off judges and lawyers and all that to keep my uncle out of jail for most of his life. That's why my dad grew up with nothing. He has no idea that I know. My parents divorced when I was 6. After which I lived with my mom. When I was 10 years old, I found a list my dad had written of things that could save their marriage, including: one year my family went on vacation where I took a lot of pictures using my dad's phone, and I wanted to put them on my computer so I could share them with friends. I grabbed his phone and started looking through his photos looking for my vacation photos when I came across my dad and mom's sex tape, nudes, etc. I never told them I found it. Nor do I go back on his phone because I don't want to see those ever again. I was fixing my dad's laptop a while later and my mom kept hovering over my shoulder telling me not to snoop through his files and don't go on anything except for what I needed to. I knew what she was hiding, but I wasn't going to tell her. I know that my mom got pregnant at 15 on purpose. She was constantly being shuttled between early 80s foster care and her own terrible family. And she felt like her only way to escape was to get emancipated through marriage. She knew my dad from school and thought he'd make the perfect husband. Smart, funny, from a seemingly good family, and he had protected her several times. So she seduced him, knowing their parents would insist on marriage if she got knocked up. And she did. Unfortunately for her, he turned out to be a drug-dealing, mentally ill teenager from a dysfunctional alcoholic family. The marriage lasted only a few months, but she did get her escape. My mom has no idea that I know this, and she'd be devastated if she knew. My dad is now with a woman he was cheating on my mom with before she died from cancer. Edit. No. My father is not named Newt nor goes by Dr. Seuss. When I was a child, we used to be semi-close to my dad's family. My grandparents came up 2+ hour drive to talk to my parents about an adult issue, and 10-year-old me was told to stay in my room with the door shut. After that, we never spoke to them again. Except for one letter that I got from them expressing sympathy when my other grandmother, who I was very close to, passed away. I had no idea what happened. Years later, I found a cousin on Facebook and we happened to go to the same college. So we met for coffee. I found out that the reason we no longer spoke was because my mom opened a whole bunch of credit cards and racked up a bunch of debt in my grandma's name that she never had any intention of paying back. My cousin and I kept it between us and she has no idea I know. Edit since this blew up. I'm about to turn 30. I have excellent credit and I check it regularly for any suspicious activity. I'm good. But thank you for all the advice. Found this out from my dad's old college roommate as my dad has never wanted to talk about this with me. Pops was working in the financial district during 9/11 and was in charge of emergency evacuation for his floor, way high up in one of the bank buildings. Saw the towers fall and had to herd everyone off his floor and out of the building. Apparently someone had a heart attack and collapsed behind their desk. He didn't find this person and they ended up dying there in the office. I think my dad might blame himself at least partially, which, on top of the trauma of witnessing the towers fall firsthand, has led him to locking that part of himself away from the world. One day I want to tell him it wasn't his fault and he did the best he could. I went to my parents' room to wake them up to drop me off to school. I saw them out cold lying naked with a dildo on the edge of the bed. I was 15. Well, which one of you dildos is going to take me to school? My dad doesn't know that I know how my grandfather, his dad, died. I had always wondered why I never knew my grandfather, but it was always a touchy subject so I never asked. I knew my dad basically grew up without his father, but I never knew why. When I was about 22 or 23 my brother told me what had happened. My grandfather had committed suicide in front of my dad when my dad was about 8 or 9 years old. Even though I know now, I still won't bring it up. Edit. I can't thank you all enough for the outpouring of support and taking the time to share your own stories. By speaking up and speaking out we can help reduce the stigma of mental health and raise awareness for those who need it. Don't know if it's horrid, but when helping my mother move from one house to another, I happened across her bag of sex toys. Which isn't all that shocking. But it included a strap-on dildo, the bag was open and it was on top. She'd been a single woman for 20 plus years and was in her late 50s at the time. I had no idea who she was using it with, nor do I want to know. If it's any help, strap-ons can be used to wrap them around pillows so you can ride them. For a woman with a bag of sex toys, that doesn't seem too far of a stretch. My parents got engaged after a drug-fueled 11-day bender in 1979. Firstborn came along in 82. Still married. Well, my father sends me letters from prison assuming I haven't heard the phone recordings where he admits to child rape. I burn everything he sends me. Also, I corroborated several claims against him when interviewed by the detective. When my grandfather died he left approx $140k American in a trust for me. It wasn't to be touched until after my parents passed away so that it could gain as much money as possible from the investments he had arranged. My grandfather was an oil tycoon in PA and no one in the family knew it until after he died. I got a call from the bank one day asking how I'd like to handle closing the accounts. I had no idea why. But apparently my parents had been taking medical bills from themselves and altering them to have my name on them. Then submitting them to the bank to be reimbursed for paying my medical bills. They had bled the trust completely dry in less than 5 years. They used the money to remodel their home. I don't think I have any recourse. But whatever. I'm 35 and I have my own retirement. It just makes me mad that they would steal from me like that. Edit 1. Added a word. Edit 2. Thank you anonymous user for my first Reddit gold. That means a lot to me. Not some horrid secret. But I sometimes hear my dad talking behind closed doors to my mom who passed away suddenly years ago. He typically tells her our life updates and that he misses her. My sister got married recently and I overheard him from outside his room telling my mom how beautiful my sister looked and how great her husband is that she never had the chance to meet. About how they had always spoke of that moment. Watching their child marry. And he wished she was there with him to see us. We rarely speak about my mom at home. But 14 years later she's still very alive in his heart. It's gut-wrenching at times. I found my dad's Yahoo Personals profile, featuring a picture of him bent over in our living room wearing nothing but assless chaps. Profile name Hot Rider for you, and it was taken with my camera. We only had one in the house. But for some reason I decided to check the EXIF. Just hoping. Close bracket. Never mentioned that one to him or my mother. When I was a kid my mom had mole removal surgery on her face. And came back and had to recover for weeks. Granted, she did have a mole removed on her face. But miraculously her A's turned into D's. Crazy how that was a side effect of face surgery. My parents were in their 30s when they met. My mom had me at 35 and my dad was almost 40. So it's understandable that they both would have had previous relationships and love lives before they met. When I was a teenager, I discovered via a drunken relative that my dad was engaged before he met my mom. He was in his 20s living in AZ. He and his fiancée were typical struggling young people living paycheck to paycheck and didn't have a car. His fiancée was pregnant and was going to walk to the corner store while he was at work. She got hit by a car and died. The drunk relative who told me this story only knew because my dad had called asking for money to help with the funeral. I cried after I learned that. I felt so sad for my dad and couldn't imagine the heartache of that. He's never spoken about it. And I have no idea if my mom knows. But I suddenly understood why he was so protective of my mom and me. This technically doesn't count because I asked my mom about it last year. But until then she didn't know I knew for about 20 or 19 years. My dad was a heroin addict and used to take my mom's money to buy drugs and alcohol. He also used to lock me and my mom up in our apartment whenever he went somewhere. My mom never told me and thought I didn't know about it because I've always been pretty oblivious and I used to be on some meds during that time. Last year I decided to sit her down and ask her about it because I never knew much about my dad or about that side of my family. My mom doesn't know I know she wasn't a virgin when she got married. She's fairly religious and says sex before marriage is a no and kind of looks down at all her siblings' family that have done it moved in before. You can say you regret it, Mom. But don't be so judgy. I know my father has a ton of nude pornographic photos of my mother. But he never really bothered to hide it that much. I also know my mother, or both my father and her, had set up an account on MSN, Microsoft Messenger, and used to dirty talk send pictures to internet people. I found out when she forgot to log out one day. I will probably never know if she did it for fun or maybe money. And my father may be cheating on my mother. Edit. People suggest it might be swinging and not cheating. I don't really know but I don't think so. My mother seemed to be annoyed at my father texting. Didn't knew who he was talking to and called him out on that multiple times. They never spend a night out. This isn't as horrid as a lot of the other comments. But still relevant. My parents don't know that I know that they're both liars and have been making shit up about each other to get me to pick sides for years. My dad took off when I was about 2 and I was left to be raised by my mother, who was in no mentally healthy state to raise a kid by herself. My dad swears he wanted to just take me and he always wanted me. But lo and behold he never showed up to the hearing deciding custody over me. My mom swears my dad has never paid child support and he's a cheap bastard. But lo and behold I find all the receipts of her receiving child support. She just didn't want to admit she was gambling it away and that's why we were dirt poor for most of my life. My parents met due to them being part of the same social circle. They both sold cocaine with my uncle and their friends. Of course. I was demonized for being caught with some weed by the same people who were included in federal indictments. My stepdad peed his pants almost every single night before he met my mom. She said he peed the bed the first night he spent over at her place. And since she has kids, she didn't say anything. Just stripped the sheets off of the bed and threw them in the washing machine. He hasn't wet the bed since. My dad wasn't present at my birth because he was serving time for attempting to beat my mom to induce an abortion. My grandmother told me in a drunk stupor a few years back. Somehow everyone in my family knew and still forgave him. My parents have been married for 22 years now, and other than a couple petty fights, I've never seen them at odds with each other. I haven't told them I know, but it definitely soured my relationship with him. My mom had a baby at the age of 16 and gave it up for adoption. Not necessarily horrid, but later in life my older sister was diagnosed with leukemia and eventually died at the age of 5. As a baby, they tested my bone marrow for a possible transfusion but was unsuccessful. To this day I wonder if the baby my mom had as a teenager would have been a match. She still has no idea, me and my younger sister know. My dad was a soldier in the late 60s early 70s and was involved in the NI troubles. His NGF was a nurse in a Belfast hospital. Now she didn't give a damn who the injured were. She was a nurse and it was her job to treat the injured. However, the IRA types found out about her relationship with my dad and didn't take kindly to it at all. One day, she just vanishes after her shift. She was found several days later, tied to a lamppost in a Belfast street. She had been kidnapped, beaten, arped, and tied naked to the post so she could be tarred and feathered. She was found dead, having frozen to death because none of the locals would help her. I only found out about 2 years ago, when the old man just starts crying out of the blue as we were having a beer together. That shit still haunts him. That's the only time I've ever seen him shed a tear. My dad was supposed to be a football prospect in high school, go to college and eventually play pro. Got FK'd over, got my mom pregnant, and joined a gang. And he got in too deep and rival gangs were threatening to shoot his whole family. He panicked and my grandpa, Sinem helicopter pilot vet, sent him off to boot camp that next day. I was babysitting my little brothers and found them getting into my mom's SX toy box. So yeah, no. Now I know my mom likes to be tied up. Or do the tying up. Mother killed someone by accident when she was young. She told me when she was drunk one night when I was really little. It was traumatic enough for me to remember. About 20 years later, I asked my father about it and after a lot of reluctance he told me that she had shot her best friend when they were playing with a gun. My mother was a juvenile so her criminal record was sealed. I think the guilt trauma of this though has caused a lot of my mother's problems. I kinda wish I knew it all earlier so that I would have better context for a lot of things that she did. My sibling still doesn't know. I found a FCK machine in their closet. Found a naked Polaroid of my dad in a box full of tiny lingerie that apparently used to fit my mum. Kudos to mum. But ugh. And that's the same day I learned not to look through other people's shit. My aunt on my dad's side confided in me that my mother's father tried to molest her and was actually really creepy and hanging around her when family got together. I can never tell my mom or my dad because they would never believe it and frankly I don't know what to think either. He's dead now and I had a great relationship with him as a grandfather growing up. My father has a child from an affair fairly early in my parents' relationship. He's a fairly close family friend and I have no idea how no one else has noticed. He's the spitting image of my dad. Mum and dad have said bits along the years about the affair. Hey, I could be wrong but the timeline fits. My dad used to draw grotesquely skinny naked women in Ms. Paint and jack off to them. Don't ask how I know this but I'd rather I didn't. My dad cheated on his wife with my mom and then I was born. They were going to try to stay married but it got too hard.